South Africa, 1985. Part 1. Footprints on Sacred Ground. The scorching African sun cast long shadows over the dry earth as Sarah stepped off the rickety bus, her feet crunching on the brittle ground. She paused, taking in the vast landscape that stretched before her, an endless sea of golden plains interrupted only by the jagged peaks of distant mountains. The air was thick with dust, and the wind carried a faint smell of smoke from small cooking fires scattered in the village. This was Ndlovu, a place where time seemed to stand still, where the modern world felt like a distant echo, barely touching the lives of the people who called this land home. Sarah, a 24-year-old missionary with unwavering faith, adjusted her worn backpack and squinted against the sun. Her heart was pounding, not from the physical exertion of her journey, but from the sheer gravity of the task before her. She had come here with a purpose, a mission that felt almost impossible: to bring water, clean, life-giving water, to a village that had been plagued by drought for years. The dry wells and contaminated streams had left the community on the brink of despair, with children falling ill and livestock dying. As she walked the narrow path toward the village center, she could feel the eyes of the villagers upon her. Women in brightly colored wraps, their faces etched with lines of hardship, paused in their work to watch the newcomer. Children, barefoot and wide-eyed, followed her at a distance, whispering in their native tongue. The adults, however, kept their distance, their faces stern and skeptical, arms crossed over their chests as if to shield themselves from yet another disappointment. Sarah's resolve did not waver, but the weight of their silent judgment pressed down on her. She could sense the history of broken promises lingering in the air like a ghost. Other outsiders had come before her, bearing promises of help, only to leave the village worse off than before. She knew she would have to earn their trust, and that it would not come easily. The village itself was a small collection of mud brick huts with thatched roofs, clustered around a central open space where a few scraggly trees struggled to survive. A makeshift church stood at the edge of the village, its white paint peeling, the cross on its roof crooked and weathered by years of neglect. This would be Sarah's home for the foreseeable future. As she approached the center of the village, an elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd. Her name was Mfo, and Sarah had been told she was the matriarch of the village, a figure of both wisdom and authority. Mfo's eyes were sharp, her face a map of wrinkles that told a story of decades spent in this unforgiving land. She wore a headscarf tied tightly around her silver hair and leaned on a wooden staff, though her posture remained proud. Mfo did not smile, nor did she offer a greeting. Instead, she studied Sarah in silence, her gaze penetrating. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but commanding, filled with the weight of years and the burden of leadership. "Why have you come here, girl?" she asked, her words deliberate and measured. Sarah stood tall, though her heart was racing. She had anticipated this moment, the moment she would have to justify her presence in a place that had been failed by so many before her. She took a deep breath, feeling the dust settle on her skin, and met Mfo's gaze with quiet determination. "I've come to help," Sarah said, her voice steady. "To bring water to your village." Mfo's eyes narrowed. "We have heard that before. Outsiders come with promises, but they do not understand our land, our people. You speak of water, but our wells are dry. The earth has turned against us. What makes you think you can succeed where others have failed?" The murmurs of the villagers grew louder, their doubt palpable in the stillness of the late afternoon. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, searching for any sign of weakness, any reason to dismiss her before she even began. She took a step closer to Mfo, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "I don't come with empty promises. I come because I believe God has sent me here to help you. I don't have all the answers, but I have faith, and I believe that together we can find a way to bring life back to this land." There was a long pause as Mfo considered Sarah's words. The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of generations of suffering pressing down on the moment. Finally, Mfo spoke, her tone still guarded, but with a hint of curiosity. You speak of your God. We have our own gods here, and they have been silent. Why would your God care for us when ours have turned their backs? Sarah smiled softly, sensing the opportunity to plant a seed of hope. My God never turns his back on anyone. He sees your struggles, your pain, and he has not forgotten you. For a moment, something flickered in Mfo's eyes, a spark of something long buried beneath years of hardship. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of doubt and weariness. We shall see, Mfo said, her voice flat. For now, you may stay in the church, but do not expect our people to trust you easily. You will have to earn that. With that, Mfo turned and walked away, her staff tapping rhythmically against the ground. The villagers began to disperse, though the children lingered a moment longer, their curiosity not yet sated. Sarah watched them go, her heart heavy but filled with determination. She made her way to the church, its doors creaking as she pushed them open. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the light dim as it filtered through the small, stained glass windows. The walls were bare except for a simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. It was a humble space, but it felt like a sanctuary after the intensity of the village. Sarah knelt at the altar, the worn stone cool beneath her knees. She bowed her head, her hands clasped tightly together in prayer. Lord, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. I don't know what lies ahead, but I trust you've brought me here for a reason. Give me the strength to endure, the wisdom to lead, and the faith to see your plan through. Help me show these people that they are not forgotten. As she prayed, the weight of the journey began to lift from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. She knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she also knew she was not walking it alone. Part 2. Seeds of Doubt, Roots of Faith. The scorching heat seemed to intensify as Sarah walked the cracked, arid earth surrounding the village. The once green fields had long since turned into a wasteland of dust and brittle grass, the sun's relentless blaze bleaching the ground pale. Her footsteps left faint marks in the soil, but the wind quickly erased any trace of her presence, as if the land itself refused to remember her. The village of Ndlovu had been without reliable water for over a year now. The small streams that once flowed through the area had dwindled into trickles before disappearing entirely. The shallow wells that once sustained the village were now dry pits of despair, and Sarah could feel the weight of the villagers' disappointment bearing down on her shoulders with every glance they cast her way. Days had turned into weeks, and Sarah's attempts to find water had yielded nothing but dust and frustration. She had used what funds she had to hire a local drilling team, their equipment old and unreliable. Each day, they drilled deeper into the unforgiving earth, but all they found was more dryness. Sarah stood at the edge of one of the drilling sites, her eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, the mountains loomed, their jagged peaks a reminder of how small and insignificant she felt in the face of such overwhelming need. The drilling rig rattled and groaned, the noise filling the heavy silence of the land. A few villagers gathered to watch, but their expressions were grim, their hope fading as quickly as the sun in the evening sky. Thando, the young village leader, approached from behind. His presence was announced by the sharp sound of his boots on the hard ground. Thando had been vocal in his skepticism from the moment Sarah arrived, and his disapproval of her efforts was clear in his sharp words and piercing glares. How much longer will you continue this charade? Thando's voice was steady, but there was a bitter edge to his words. You've been here for weeks, and yet the only thing we have to show for it is more dry earth. You speak of faith, but faith will not fill our wells. Sarah turned to face him, feeling the sting of his words, but refusing to let them shake her. I never said it would be easy, Thando. Faith isn't about seeing results immediately. It's about trusting in something greater than ourselves, even when things seem impossible. Thando crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. My people do not have the luxury of waiting. Our children are sick, our livestock is dying, and we cannot afford to waste time on empty promises. Sarah felt a pang of guilt in her chest, but she stood firm. I know you've been let down before, and I know that you don't trust me. But I believe that God brought me here for a reason. I believe that there is water beneath this land, and we will find it. Thando shook his head, a humorless chuckle escaping his lips. You are a stubborn woman, Sarah, but stubbornness alone will not save us. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone by the drill site. She watched him go, feeling the weight of his doubts settle over her like a dark cloud. The villagers who had gathered slowly dispersed as well, their silent judgment hanging in the air long after they had gone. Sarah took a deep breath and knelt beside the drill, running her fingers through the dry soil. She whispered a prayer, her voice barely audible over the clanging of the machinery. God, I need your help, she murmured, her fingers sifting through the dirt. I know you sent me here for a reason, but I can't do this alone. Show me the way forward. Let your will be done. The drill continued to whir and rattle. But deep inside, Sarah felt a flicker of peace. She stood, brushing the dust from her hands, and turned back toward the village. Later that evening, Sarah walked the narrow pathways between the small huts, the sky above painted with the fiery colors of sunset. The village was quiet, with only the sounds of cooking fires crackling and the distant bleating of goats in the air. As Sarah made her way to one of the outer huts, she was greeted by a group of children playing in the dirt. Their laughter was infectious, a small ray of light amidst the bleakness of the village's situation. They smiled at her and called out her name, their voices bright and full of energy. Sarah, Sarah, come and see, a little girl with braids shouted, waving her over to a small group of children who were gathered around a game of stones. For a moment, Sarah's heart lifted. She crouched down beside them, watching as they showed her how to play their simple game, their faces filled with joy. It was in these small moments she realized that hope was born, not in the grand gestures or the miraculous outcomes, but in the quiet faith of children who, despite everything, still found reasons to smile. She spent the evening visiting homes, offering prayers and small acts of kindness where she could. One woman, Miriam, whose baby had been sick for weeks, invited Sarah in for tea. Miriam's eyes were tired, her face lined with worry, but she managed a soft smile as Sarah entered her modest home. We are grateful for your presence here, Miriam said as she poured Sarah a cup of tea. Even if the others do not say it, the children love you, and for that I am thankful. Sarah took the cup and smiled. Thank you, Miriam. I know it's been difficult, and I don't want to give false hope, but I believe that we're on the right path. I believe God will provide for this village. Miriam nodded, her expression thoughtful. I hope so. We have had many promises before, but none have come true. Still, there is something different about you, Sarah. Your heart is in the right place. Sarah sipped her tea, the warm liquid soothing her parched throat. Thank you. That means more to me than you know. As the night deepened and the stars began to appear in the sky, Sarah returned to the small church that had become her sanctuary. The village slept, but Sarah could not rest. She knelt once again at the altar, the dim light from the oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the walls. Lord, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, I am trying so hard, but I can't do this without you. These people need more than I can give them. They need you. Show me the way, Father. Please. The silence of the night was her only reply, but Sarah knew that even in the silence, God was listening. The next day, Sarah returned to the drilling site with renewed determination. The team worked tirelessly under the hot sun, their hands blistered and their clothes soaked with sweat. Sarah worked alongside them, refusing to stand by idly while they toiled. She carried water, fetched tools, and encouraged the workers with words of faith, even when her own faith felt like it was hanging by a thread. As the days passed, the villagers began to notice. They saw Sarah's willingness to work, to suffer alongside them, and though they remained skeptical, there was a subtle shift in the air. The children continued to flock to her, and even Fo, the village matriarch, began to visit the drilling site more frequently, her sharp eyes watching from a distance. It was slow, agonizing work, but Sarah held on to her faith like a lifeline. She knew that God had not abandoned them, even when the well remained dry, even when the villagers whispered of failure. She knew that somewhere beneath the earth there was water. She just had to believe. And she did. As the sun set once again over the village of Ndlovu, Sarah stood at the drilling site, her hands clasped in prayer. The ground beneath her feet was dry and cracked, but in her heart, she knew that something was stirring, something far greater than the doubts and fears that surrounded her. Faith was not about the absence of doubt. It was about moving forward in spite of it. Part 3. Shadows of Despair, Glimmers of Faith. As night fell over Ndlovu, the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, that might break the cycle of hopelessness. The land was as parched as ever, and the dry well at the edge of the village stood as a silent testament to the failures that had come before. Inside the small church, Sarah knelt at the altar, the flickering light of an oil lamp casting soft shadows across the walls. Her knees pressed against the cold stone floor, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight on her heart. She had been here for months now, struggling to bring clean water to a people who had almost forgotten what hope tasted like. Each day that passed without success chipped away at her spirit, but she refused to give up. God had sent her here. She was certain of that. And yet, with each failed attempt to drill into the earth, doubt crept further into her thoughts. The church was quiet, save for the soft sounds of the wind outside. In the distance, Sarah could hear the faint bleating of goats and the crackling of small cooking fires. But inside these walls, the silence was profound. She had always found solace in prayer, but tonight, her words felt hollow, as if they were falling into an abyss instead of reaching heaven. "Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know what more I can do. I've tried everything. The wells remain dry, and the people are losing faith in me. I feel so small, so powerless. Please, show me a sign that you're still here with me." For a moment, she stayed there, eyes closed, hands clasped tightly together. But no sign came. No voice, no miraculous revelation. Just the soft hum of the night and the distant chirp of crickets. She rose slowly, her legs stiff from kneeling, and made her way to the door of the church, pushing it open to step outside into the cool night air. The village was cloaked in darkness, with only a few lanterns glowing faintly from inside the huts. Sarah looked up at the sky, the stars above gleaming like diamonds scattered across black velvet. For a moment, she let herself get lost in their beauty, reminding herself that even in the darkest of times, light still existed. The next day dawned with the same oppressive heat that had marked every other day in Ndlovu. Sarah stood with the workers at the drilling site, their faces lined with exhaustion and frustration. The drill clanked and groaned as it churned through the stubborn earth, but Sarah could tell by the sound that it would yield nothing once again. Thando arrived shortly after noon, his expression as hard as the dry soil they were trying to penetrate. His skepticism had only grown over the past few weeks, and it was clear that he no longer believed in Sarah's mission or in her God. "This is pointless," Thando said, his voice sharp. "You're wasting your time and ours. The land has been cursed for years. No amount of drilling will change that." Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow and turned to face him. The heat bore down on her, but it was nothing compared to the coldness in Thando's words. "I refuse to believe that this land is cursed. I believe that God has a plan for this village, even if we can't see it yet." Thando laughed bitterly. "Your faith is admirable, but faith won't bring water. My people are suffering. The children are sick. What good is your God if he can't even bring us water?" His words cut deep, but Sarah stood her ground. "It's not for us to question his timing. All I ask is that you have faith, even when it seems impossible." Thando shook his head, his expression a mixture of anger and pity. "Faith is for dreamers, Sarah. My people need action, not dreams." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah to face the growing doubt that gnawed at her heart. She could feel the weight of failure pressing down on her, but deep within, a small flicker of faith remained. She couldn't explain it, but something inside her refused to let go of hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the day wore on, the situation at the drilling site grew more tense. The workers, exhausted and disheartened, began to question whether continuing was worth the effort. Some suggested packing up and leaving, while others argued for pushing on just a little further. Sarah could see the cracks in their resolve, and she knew that if they left now, the villagers would lose what little hope they had left. But how could she ask them to keep going when even she wasn't sure they would succeed? That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sarah gathered a small group of believers from the village. They were the few who still held on to the hope that God would provide, despite the mounting failures. They met at the church, their voices low and filled with weariness, but they came together with one purpose: to pray. Fo, the elderly matriarch, was among them. Though her initial skepticism had not entirely faded, she had begun to see something in Sarah that intrigued her: a quiet strength, a determination that went beyond mere stubbornness. And though she had lived long enough to know the sting of broken promises, she found herself drawn to this young woman's faith. As the small group gathered around the altar, Sarah led them in prayer. Her voice was soft but steady, each word infused with a deep sense of urgency. Lord, we come to you tonight because we believe in your power. We believe that you have not forgotten this village, that you see the suffering of these people. We ask you to show your mercy, to let your living water flow through this land. The villagers bowed their heads, their hands clasped tightly together as they prayed for a miracle. For hours, they remained in the church, their voices rising and falling like waves, their prayers blending into the stillness of the night. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves that clung to the few surviving trees. By midnight, the group had grown weary, and many had fallen asleep where they sat, their prayers replaced by the soft sounds of breathing. But Sarah remained awake, her heart heavy with the weight of their hopes and fears. She moved to the open door of the church, stepping out into the cool night air. The sky was cloudless, and the stars above seemed closer than ever. She could hear the distant sounds of the village, but the stillness of the land made it feel as though she were alone in the vast expanse. God, she whispered, I don't know what more I can do. I've led them in prayer, I've worked with my hands, and still, the earth remains dry. If this is a test of faith, I'm afraid I'm failing. Please show us a sign. Let them see your power. Let them know you are with them. Sarah stayed there for what felt like hours, her eyes searching the horizon for something, anything, that might offer a glimmer of hope. But the night remained still, the land silent. The dawn arrived quietly, the first rays of sunlight stretching across the village as the people began to stir from their sleep. Sarah had not slept, her thoughts consumed by the enormity of the task before her. She stood at the door of the church, watching as the villagers slowly gathered their belongings and prepared for another day of hard labor. Just as the first drilling crew arrived at the site, a tremor rippled through the ground beneath their feet. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it quickly grew stronger, the earth beneath them groaning and shifting as though awakening from a long slumber. Sarah's heart leapt in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She ran to the drilling site, where the workers stood frozen in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. And then, as if in answer to their prayers, the ground split open, revealing a deep fissure. From within the dark crevice, water began to flow, clear, cool water that sparkled in the morning light. A gasp rose from the gathered crowd, their eyes fixed on the miracle unfolding before them. Part 4. Waters of Revelation. Fo, the elderly matriarch, was among them. Though her initial skepticism had not entirely faded, she had begun to see something in Sarah that intrigued her, a quiet strength, a determination that went beyond mere stubbornness. And though she had lived long enough to know the sting of broken promises, she found herself drawn to this young woman's faith. As the small group gathered around the altar, Sarah led them in prayer. Her voice was soft but steady, each word infused with a deep sense of urgency. Lord, we come to you tonight because we believe in your power. We believe that you have not forgotten this village, that you see the suffering of these people. We ask you to show your mercy, to let your living water flow through this land." The villagers bowed their heads, their hands clasped tightly together as they prayed for a miracle. For hours, they remained in the church, their voices rising and falling like waves, their prayers blending into the stillness of the night. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves that clung to the few surviving trees. By midnight, the group had grown weary, and many had fallen asleep where they sat, their prayers replaced by the soft sounds of breathing. But Sarah remained awake, her heart heavy with the weight of their hopes and fears. She moved to the open door of the church, stepping out into the cool night air. The sky was cloudless, and the stars above seemed closer than ever. She could hear the distant sounds of the village, but the stillness of the land made it feel as though she were alone in the vast expanse. "God," she whispered, "I don't know what more I can do. I've led them in prayer. I've worked with my hands, and still the earth remains dry. If this is a test of faith, I'm afraid I'm failing. Please show us a sign. Let them see your power. Let them know you are with them." Sarah stayed there for what felt like hours, her eyes searching the horizon for something, anything that might offer a glimmer of hope. But the night remained still, the land silent. The dawn arrived quietly, the first rays of sunlight stretching across the village as the people began to stir from their sleep. Sarah had not slept, her thoughts consumed by the enormity of the task before her. She stood at the door of the church, watching as the villagers slowly gathered their belongings and prepared for another day of hard labor. Just as the first drilling crew arrived at the site, a tremor rippled through the ground beneath their feet. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it quickly grew stronger, the earth beneath them groaning and shifting as though awakening from a long slumber. Sarah's heart leapt in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She ran to the drilling site, where the workers stood frozen in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. And then, as if in answer to their prayers, the ground split open, revealing a deep fissure. From within the dark crevice, water began to flow, clear, cool water that sparkled in the morning light. A gasp rose from the gathered crowd, their eyes fixed on the miracle unfolding before them. The village of Ndlovu was silent as the earth trembled beneath their feet. The faint, rhythmic rumble grew louder, sending waves of shock through the gathered villagers. It was as if the land had come alive, its deep groans echoing across the barren plains. At the drilling site, the workers froze, their tools clattering to the ground as they exchanged wide-eyed glances, uncertain whether to run or remain still. Sarah stood in the middle of the chaos, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, the world around her seemed to slow, every sound fading into the background as she watched the impossible unfold before her. The fissure that had cracked open just moments before was now gushing with water. Clean, crystal-clear water that sparkled in the early morning sunlight. The air was heavy with disbelief. Villagers who had once mocked her efforts now stared in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and fear. No one dared move, as if they feared the miracle before them might vanish if they so much as blinked. Thando, who had been one of the loudest voices of doubt, stood at the edge of the gathering. His eyes were locked on the stream of water flowing freely from the earth. His expression, normally hardened with skepticism, softened, as though the weight of years of disappointment was being washed away with each drop of water. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his disbelief giving way to curiosity. "How is this possible?" Thando whispered, though the question seemed directed more to himself than to anyone else. He knelt down beside the flowing water, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch it. The cool liquid slipped through his fingers, a sensation that felt almost surreal after so many years of drought. The moment his hand made contact, it was as though a dam had broken, not in the earth, but in the hearts of the people. The villagers surged forward, their cautious steps turning into a joyous rush as they crowded around the fissure, dipping their hands into the water, drinking deeply, laughing, crying. Children splashed gleefully, their faces lit with pure, unfiltered joy, while the elders wept, their tears mingling with the water that now flowed like a gift from heaven. Sarah stood back, watching the scene unfold, her own eyes filling with tears. She had prayed for this moment, hoped for it with every fiber of her being, but seeing it come to pass was more than she had ever dared to imagine. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she whispered a prayer of thanks. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for showing them your power. Thank you for not abandoning these people." But even as the celebration grew louder, Sarah knew this was more than just about water. This was about faith, about showing the people of Ndlovu that they had not been forsaken, that God's grace had never left them. She could see it in their eyes, in the way they looked at the flowing water with reverence and disbelief. As the crowd continued to celebrate, Mfo, the elderly matriarch, approached Sarah with slow, deliberate steps. Her face, normally composed and guarded, was soft now, her eyes shining with emotion. She came to stand beside Sarah, watching the villagers rejoice. "You did it," Mfo said quietly, though her tone held no surprise, only a deep, profound respect. "I didn't believe you at first. I didn't believe that your God would care for us after all these years." Sarah smiled, but there was no pride in her expression, only humility. "It wasn't me, Mfo. It was God. He was always here, even when it felt like he wasn't." Mfo's gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment before she turned to look at the water. "Our gods have been silent for so long. We thought we had been cursed. But now, I see that maybe your God is different." Sarah took Mfo's hand, her grip gentle but firm. "He sees you, Mfo. He sees all of you, and he has never forgotten you." Mfo nodded slowly, her eyes filling with unshed tears. For so long, she had carried the burden of the village's suffering, the weight of countless failed promises and broken hopes. But now, standing before this miracle, she felt something lift, a release, as if the water flowing from the earth had also washed away the years of despair that had clung to her heart. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The villagers worked together to channel the water into storage containers and basins, eager to preserve the gift that had been given to them. Sarah moved among them, helping where she could, her heart light with joy as she saw the transformation taking place not just in the land, but in the people themselves. Thando, who had once been her harshest critic, approached her near the well. His face was no longer hard, his posture no longer defensive. Instead, there was a quiet humility in his gaze, as if he had been shaken to his core. "I was wrong," Thando said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't believe in you. I didn't believe in your God. But now, I can't deny what I've seen." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile warm. "It's not about me, Thando. It's about faith. God never abandoned you, even when it felt like he did. He was always here, waiting for the right moment to show his grace." Thando nodded, his eyes downcast as he processed her words. "I've spent so long being angry, at the world, at the land, at everything. I don't know how to have faith." "It's not something that happens all at once," Sarah replied gently. "It's a journey, and the fact that you're open to it now, that's the first step." Thando met her gaze, his expression softening. "Thank you, Sarah, for not giving up on us, for not giving up on me." Sarah's smile deepened. "I never could have done this without God. He's the one who led me here, and he's the one who made this possible." The rest of the village began to gather around Sarah, their faces filled with gratitude and awe. They looked at her not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who had been sent to them in their darkest hour. Someone who had brought not just water, but hope. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and red, the village gathered around the newly formed stream. The celebration continued well into the night, songs of joy and praise filling the air as the people of Ndlovu came together in a way they hadn't in years. Sarah watched from a distance, her heart full as she saw the transformation taking place. The village, once broken and divided by years of hardship, was now united, by faith, by hope, and by the grace of God. Part 5. Rivers of Faith, Fields of Grace. Months had passed since the miraculous water had erupted from the earth, and the village of Ndlovu was unrecognizable from the drought-ridden place Sarah had first encountered. The barren fields that had once stretched endlessly into the horizon were now alive with green crops. The dry earth transformed into fertile soil that yielded an abundance of food. The once quiet village, subdued by the weight of despair, now buzzed with life and laughter, the joy of renewal evident in every corner. The stream that had emerged from the fissure had become the heart of the village. Its crystal-clear waters flowed freely, feeding the fields and providing fresh, clean water to every home. Children played by the stream's edge, their laughter mingling with the sound of rushing water, while adults worked diligently to maintain the irrigation channels they had built to direct the life-giving resource. The transformation had not just been physical. It had touched the very souls of the villagers, reigniting a sense of hope and purpose that had long been buried. Sarah walked through the village, her steps light as she observed the changes. She passed by homes where families sat together, sharing meals and stories, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns. The air was thick with the scent of cooking fires and freshly baked bread, a far cry from the barren, lifeless atmosphere that had once hung over Ndlovu like a shroud. She stopped by the edge of the stream, kneeling to cup her hands in the cool water. The sensation of the water slipping through her fingers was still a marvel to her, a tangible reminder of God's grace, flowing endlessly through this land that had once been forsaken. As she drank, she closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer of thanks. "Sarah," the voice came from behind her, and she turned to see Thando approaching, his face no longer marred by the anger and doubt that had once defined him. His steps were sure and steady, and there was a peace about him that Sarah hadn't seen before. "You've brought life back to this village," Thando said, stopping beside her. "It's more than just the water. You brought us faith, hope. I see it in the way people talk, the way they work. You've given us something that I never thought we'd have again." Sarah smiled softly. "It wasn't me, Thando. It was always God. He just used me as a vessel." Thando looked out over the fields, where villagers worked together to tend the crops. "I used to believe that we were cursed," he admitted, "that no amount of effort or prayer could change what was happening here. I've spent years in anger, pushing people away, building walls around myself. But now," he paused, his gaze distant for a moment before turning back to Sarah. "Now I understand. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when the answers aren't clear." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Faith is a journey. It doesn't come all at once. But you've already taken the first step." Thando let out a soft chuckle, his expression lighter than Sarah had ever seen it. "You've taught me more than I ever expected, Sarah. I see things differently now. I see the grace in every drop of water, in every blade of grass." For a moment, they stood together in silence, watching as the villagers worked side by side. It was a scene of unity and purpose, something that had once seemed impossible in a village torn apart by years of drought and hardship. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields, the village gathered by the stream for a time of prayer and thanksgiving. The sounds of praise filled the air, carried by voices that had once been silenced by despair. Fo, now a respected spiritual leader in the village, led the prayers, her voice steady and strong as she gave thanks for the blessings they had received. Sarah stood at the edge of the gathering, her heart full as she listened to the prayers. She had come to Ndlovu with a mission to bring water, but she had found something far greater. She had witnessed the transformation of an entire community, not just in their physical surroundings, but in their hearts. As the prayers continued, a small child, no older than 6, tugged at Sarah's hand. The child's wide eyes were filled with wonder as she looked up at Sarah. "Are you going to leave us now that we have the water?" she asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. Sarah knelt down to the child's level, brushing a strand of hair away from the little girl's face. "I'm going to be leaving soon, yes," she replied gently. "But just because I'm leaving doesn't mean that God's grace will leave. The water will keep flowing, and so will His love." The child smiled, satisfied with the answer, before running off to join the other children playing by the stream. Sarah stood, watching them with a mixture of pride and peace. The time had come for her to move on, but she knew that Ndlovu was in good hands now. Later that evening, after the prayers had ended and the villagers had returned to their homes, Sarah found herself sitting by the stream, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky. The night was cool, the gentle breeze carrying with it the scent of the fertile earth. Mfo approached, her steps slow and deliberate, the weight of years etched into every movement. She sat beside Sarah, her old eyes reflecting the light of the stars. "You'll be leaving us soon, won't you?" Mfo asked, her voice quiet but knowing. Sarah nodded. "Yes, my work here is done. You and the village have everything you need now." Mfo was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the water as it flowed steadily past them. "You have changed us, Sarah. Not just our land, but our hearts. For so long, we were blind to the grace that was all around us. You opened our eyes." "It wasn't me, Mfo," Sarah said, shaking her head. "It was God. His grace was always here, waiting for the right moment." Mfo smiled a soft, knowing smile. "You are wise beyond your years, child. You are a blessing to this world." Sarah felt a warmth in her chest, but there was no pride, only deep gratitude for having been a part of something so profound. As the night deepened, Sarah said her final goodbyes to the villagers. The gratitude in their eyes was overwhelming, but Sarah knew that she was leaving them stronger, more unified, and filled with a faith that would sustain them long after she was gone. The next morning, Sarah packed her few belongings, her heart heavy but at peace. The village gathered to see her off, their faces full of love and appreciation. Thando, Mfo, and the children waved as Sarah climbed into the old truck that would take her to the next part of her journey. As the truck rumbled to life and began to pull away, Sarah looked back at the village one last time. The stream, the crops, the smiles on the faces of the people. Everything had changed. Ndlovu was alive again, not just with water, but with hope, with faith, with grace. And as the village disappeared from view, Sarah whispered one last prayer. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for letting me be a part of this." The road stretched out before her, endless and unknown, but Sarah was ready for whatever came next. She had seen God's grace in action, and she knew that it would continue to flow, just like the water in Ndlovu. And so, with her heart full and her spirit renewed, Sarah moved forward, knowing that the path of grace would always lead her where she needed to be. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.